once again, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at today's webinar, which Brodies are presenting in coordination with Nortal and Pentest. There are three of us speaking this morning. The good news is that the legal bit is being kept to a minimum, so the people you're going to hear from most will be Craig Kennedy, who is Head of Cyber Risk at Nortal, and Steve, who's a Senior Account Manager at Pentest. Craig and I have worked together for a number of years. We're both at a law firm before. And I think this is the bit where Craig is nervous that I'm going to say something other than what he asked me to say about him, but I'm going to stick to script and say Craig's a former lawyer with a significant amount of experience in fraud and cybercrime investigations. As I say, we used to work together in our previous lives, but he now works for Nortal, which is one of Europe's leading cyber and digital transformation consultancies. He regularly advises national and multinational companies on the risks associated with cybercrime. He's currently advising one of the world's largest infrastructure projects on cyber and business resilience issues, and he is a keen advocate of proactive cyber resilience. And I can confirm he does like talking about all things cyber. Steve has had a much more interesting career than either Craig or I. Steve is a senior account manager with Pentest, which I now know stands for penetration testing. So hopefully you'll all learn as much about cyber resilience as I've learned from speaking to Craig and Steve over the last few weeks. But Steve spent over 20 years in the IT industry, focusing on network integration and data storage, working in conjunction with HP, Dell, and IBM. But he then moved into the much more interesting arena of cybersecurity, and he spent the last 10 years doing that, focusing on protecting networks from attacks. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Malcolm Gunyon. I'm one of the partners in the litigation and health and safety teams at Brodies, having joined the firm in October last year. And we're delighted to have all of you with us this morning. What we're going to talk about today, it's obviously a slightly unusual topic to bring cybersecurity and health and safety together. So what we want to do in the next hour or so is to explain why we've done that and to give you an understanding of why we think cybersecurity and health and safety actually sit well together. So we're going to go through the what, the why, and the how. Craig is going to give us the what, which is an overview of current global cybersecurity threats. Then Craig and Steve are going to take us through the how, and we're going to look at a presentation of industry sector case studies, looking at transport, energy, and food and drink. And we're going to, I guess, scare you all a little bit by telling you exactly how cyber attackers would mount an attack in each of these industries. And then obviously it wouldn't be a law firm seminar without a brief section on the law. So I'm going to do the why. Why are we talking about health and safety and cyber attacks together? What does the law say about your responsibilities in the health and safety sphere in relation to digital attacks? And then Craig will come in at the end again to give us some top tips on how to protect your business from cybersecurity threats. And we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Craig.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. So good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Kennedy. I'm Head of Cyber Risk at Nortal. If I could have my first slide, please. So recent world events have made the subject matter of this event highly topical. At the beginning of last year, the National Cyber Security Centre issued heightened cyber threat guidance ahead of the war in Ukraine. And that guidance came amidst concerns that tensions in Ukraine may result in an upsurge in cyber attacks against Western businesses. Now, last month, the National Cyber Security Centre issued a further warning of an emerging threat to critical national infrastructure in the West. And the alert highlighted that the risk came from state-aligned groups, particularly those that were sympathetic to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. GCHQ warned that those groups could launch destructive and disruptive attacks against Western businesses. And as money would not be the primary motivation for those types of attacks, they were deemed to be much less predictable than those carried out by more familiar threat actors. Now, instead, those types of attack would seek maximum publicity and embarrassment for both its targets and the political infrastructure that sits around the target. And this most recent update not only escalates the threat guidance, but unusually provides predictions in terms of the threat, in terms of both geography and likely targets. Next slide, please. So some of you might recall the headlines from last month, which reported that Russia's global and domestic cyber warfare tactics had been leaked to various media outlets. Those reports revealed that cybersecurity experts were training Russian military and intelligence agencies to support hacking operations and train operatives to carry out attacks on critical national infrastructure, including those in the transport and energy sectors. So the recent warning from the National Cybersecurity Centre seems all the more timely, given the headlines which tell us that cyber warfare on a global scale is actively being pursued by Russia, particularly given the overarching threat to the West. Next slide, please. So we all know that cyber attacks are rarely out of the headlines, and every business, big or small, is vulnerable. If I could have 2 more clicks on this slide, please. James Comey, the former head of the FBI, once famously said there's only 2 types of company, those that have been hacked and those that don't know it yet. And that does still ring true because many businesses continue to struggle with cyber resilience. Now, this slide sets out the main risks associated with cyber threat and why it's so difficult to get the basics right. And perhaps the most obvious difficulty is the continually evolving threat landscape. Now, where threats continue to evolve, so too does the need to have a dynamic security posture. And that can be a challenged industry as nobody has an infinite IT security budget. And with so many providers in the market, it can be a challenge to keep up with the vast range of products in the market, far less weave them into an effective, comprehensive security solution. Now, another challenge businesses face is a lack of understanding of how a cyber attack would manifest itself within their organization. And that's something we hope we can bring to life for you today. Now, many organizations fail to harmonize their cybersecurity posture and their business continuity posture, meaning even if their cyber resilience is reasonable, there are no complementary policies and procedures in place directing the response to a crisis. And it's only by understanding that and testing how a business would respond to a crisis that is able to identify whether it is anything close to the appropriate level of resilience within its organization. Now, the plot thickens so far as threats to industrial control systems or operational technology is concerned. The risks remain the same, but the challenges differ. And it's often the case that conventional cybersecurity measures that would be used to mitigate cyber threat in a conventional office scenario can't be used to safeguard these types of systems. So very often industrial controls use antiquated infrastructure which can't be updated or protected. And clearly having a static cybersecurity posture paired with a constantly evolving threat landscape is an extremely dangerous combination, as new threats can be developed which take advantage of historic weaknesses. Now, many organizations are aware of the security vulnerabilities in OT technology, but can't readily resolve those issues given the cost and disruption that would inevitably be associated with doing so. And quite often, it's the case that security measures in OT technology only detect rather than prevent threats, by which point it can be too late to prevent the payload from being deployed. Now, historically, air gaps were quite commonly built into these types of systems to distance critical infrastructure from online threats. But sometimes those air gaps aren't capable of being maintained as the infrastructure ages, which can expose the infrastructure to wider network threats. And an increasing number of new systems are being built without air gaps, which can see industrial control systems being incorporated into the more conventional IT infrastructure. And that can expose it to any threats that manage to find their way into the network. So what we plan to do this morning is run through 3 scenarios in each of the sectors that Malcolm indicated at the start. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Agent X. If we could have the first video, please.
My name is Agent X. I began my career in the military. I can't say much about my previous life, but let's just say I used computers rather than weapons for the attacks I was involved in. I led a crack team of hackers who could overcome even best-in-class security measures. Military targets have military-grade encryptions, so if you can get through that, you can get through anything. We were always successful. After life in the military, I went into cybersecurity. It bored me, as I knew the truth, that nothing could keep someone with my set of skills out for long. Things are a lot more interesting where I work now. The services we provide are not advertised, but the people who need us know where to find us. Nation-states pay us to help them compromise the digital security of their targets. Once we get in, they'll tell us what they want us to do. They make the decisions, we follow instructions. The people that instruct me are getting bored with conventional targets. They're looking for something that will make a bigger impact, something that will cause catastrophic results. I've written a program that can compromise any rail network in the world. If I told you how I did it, you'd know how to stop it. Nobody does. But you want to know the really scary bit? You don't need my skills to compromise a network. Anyone can pretend to be a cleaner. And once you're in the office, you can do whatever you please. You just need to find a computer and plug in one of these. A weaponized USB stick. And once we're in the network, we can do whatever we like. But we can pretend to be anyone. And if we look like we belong, nobody will challenge us. They never do. Targeting people online is easier than it ever was in the military. We don't have to be near an asset. We don't even have to be in the same country. It's simple to find out whose identity will help us meet our objectives. We just need to do our homework, and that's easier than it's ever been. It's surprising what you can learn about people, and once we know who to pretend to be, we can target everyone in the organization. We just need to pick a senior executive, spoof their email address, and send a reasonably plausible message to their staff. Who will open it? We don't care. Someone will. It only takes one of them to open it. Just one. And once they do, we're in. Just one click is all it takes to give us the access we need to begin the reconnaissance stage, to gather the intelligence we need to successfully execute the attack. Once we understand the systems, we can decide what to compromise and when. We can deploy the attack at peak times to maximize impact to meet the mission objectives. It's not hard to imagine the consequences of our actions. Maybe the train hardware could be compromised. Maybe we could interfere with the signaling systems. Maybe we could interfere with gates, CCTV, or platform information to cause overcrowding and risk to life. But you better be ready for us. Because when we come looking for you, there will be no stopping us. And just like that, we'll be gone before you even knew we were there, leaving you to pick up the pieces and explain to anyone who cares to ask how it was so easy for us to do what we did.
So the scenario we've just watched gives us some clues of the types of things that hackers will be looking at to carry out these types of attacks. We know from the warning issued by the National Cybersecurity Centre that nation states are increasingly looking at ways in which to target critical national infrastructure. And that presents organisations with three big questions. How will the hackers get in? What will they do once they're in? And what will the impact of that be? So turning first to the question of how they get in. Many people come to cybersecurity following a career in the military, so it's fair to assume that some potential adversaries will have been well trained and are capable of deploying sustained, coordinated attacks, particularly where they're backed by nation states. Similarly, we know from the leaked Vulcan files that some of these people, much like Agent X, are now guns for hire that are capable of being sought out and deployed by official sources for criminal acts. The FBI Most Wanted list now has a cyber section, which is the clearest indicator that these types of attack can and do take place frequently. Now, industrial control systems present two very difficult issues from a cybersecurity perspective. First, they're often very old and not capable of being supported by modern security solutions. And second, traditional IT security measures are not capable of being used on them, which brings organizations a significant vulnerability from an operational, legal, and regulatory perspective. Now, in this scenario, it was said that Agent X had written software that could compromise any rail network. And whilst intelligence suggests that rail networks are something that state-sponsored hackers plan to target, this is one of the main difficulties of emerging threats. Nobody quite knows what form the attacks will take until they're seen in the wild. What we do know is hackers rarely try harder than they have to. So the route into organizations are likely to rely heavily on social engineering, whether that be through compromising offices, like the cleaner we saw, or using weaponized USBs. Now, many organizations instruct red teaming attacks where people like Nortal and Pentest attack the organization to discover the extent to which they're capable of being compromised. And in the early days of these types of attacks, simply leaving a USB on top of a cigarette bin outside an office with payroll information written on it was enough to lure a curious employee into plugging it into a system and compromising the network. Now, even the most basic cybersecurity training courses now flag that risk, so employees are rarely caught out by it. But phishing remains the most effective attack vector, and where that's combined with a whaling attack, where a senior executive's email account is mocked up and an email sent to staff members, things become a lot more effective. Seeing a familiar name can often catch people off guard, and test exercises reveal a significant number of staff click on phishing training emails containing literally every red flag there is. But email spoofing can be used for things like ordering uniforms. So the chap you saw standing in the high vis by the rail tracks could be a product of your supply chain being compromised and having uniforms or track routes compromised, which would enable or facilitate physically tampering with the track. So once hackers gain access to a system, they'll typically embark on a reconnaissance stage, where they basically see what they have access to and take the time they need to learn the systems to understand the damage they can cause to the target. Now, many people think that cyber attacks are like ram raids, where a car smashes through a shop window and the thieves leap out and steal what they can carry, but nothing could be further from the truth. Very often, hackers are in systems for a considerable length of time to make sure that the attack has the biggest possible impact, and many threat actors are highly skilled and can remain undetected for a long time. Now, this could be particularly dangerous where state-sponsored threat actors or advanced persistent threats are planning an attack, as they could extensively research their target to ensure that they strike at peak times for maximum impact. So what could the hackers do once they gain access? Well, if they gain unauthorized access to a real company's operational systems, they could maliciously manipulate those systems to create unsafe conditions. At worst, they could potentially divert trains onto the wrong tracks or cause collisions between trains. It's often the case that once hackers are in, they can do everything a business can in the normal course of business. So it's easy to see just how dangerous these types of attack can be. And that's especially so where attacks aren't financially motivated and are being perpetrated for hostile purposes. Now, hackers could also exploit vulnerabilities in the rail company's communication systems, including the central control network, radio systems, and other critical communication channels. And by compromising those systems, they could disrupt real-time communication between train operators, control centers, and maintenance crews, leading to confusion, mismanagement, and potential accidents. Attackers could infiltrate the rail company's scheduling and dispatching systems, altering train routes, departure times, or arrival schedules. And this manipulation could lead to overcrowded platforms, create confusion amongst passengers, and potentially impact the overall efficiency of the rail network. Now, overcrowding at stations at peak times could also present significant health and safety issues, as the clip in the video we just saw suggested. And hackers could target a rail company's control systems and infrastructure like signalling, switches, interlocking systems to disrupt the services. And by gaining unauthorized access, they can manipulate anything that could potentially cause a threat. So it's important to realize that cyber threat isn't something that simply impacts an organization's IT team or infrastructure. It has the potential to go right to the core of your business as usual operations and can have a very significant knock-on effect as each of these potential outcomes illustrates. So the next scenario that we're going to look at focuses on the energy industry. And if you could play the next video, please.
We are REvil, the world's leading cyber threat actor. For years, we've been targeting conventional IT systems, but businesses are fighting back, and we need to find new ways to put pressure on our targets to pay. We have developed ransomware that targets and cripples industrial control systems and other operational technology infrastructure. This is the threat of the future. Our motivation is money, plain and simple. And the bigger the risk, the more people pay. These are our targets: oil rigs. They rely heavily on technology, and their owners have deep pockets. The best part is, they can be compromised by the click of a button. Once someone clicks on a weaponized link, their machine is compromised within 3 seconds. The entire network is compromised in only a few minutes more. This is our way into industrial control systems. Once we gain access, we can manipulate them to cause whatever impact we want. From that point onwards, we are in control. Very often, all it takes is a subtle change to standard operating procedures to cause catastrophic results. And in these types of businesses, big problems threaten lives. Of course, most big businesses have teams of people to try and keep us out. But we always take our victims by surprise. The big difference is they are panicking and we are not. People make bad decisions when they panic, and businesses are run by people. You can train for emergencies all you want, but nothing can really replicate a real-life emergency, where systems are down, lives are at risk, and you're not in control. You'll only try to shut systems down after you spot the problem, and by that point, it's too late. The damage has already been done. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. We know how to put pressure on you, and if you don't pay us, there will be serious consequences. We are in control of your systems. We are in control of your machinery. We decide what happens next. And don't forget, you're going to have to battle us whilst you're dealing with the fallout of what we bring to your door. How are you going to explain that you put lives at risk to protect your profits? How are you going to explain how easy it was for us to get in? You'll have to declare a crisis. But then what? What happens next? How do you manage the crisis? How do you save lives? What do you tell customers? Can you continue to operate? These are all things you'll have to decide. But in a crisis, time is of the essence and time isn't on your side. But it's not just us applying pressure. The newspapers will be helping us, although they don't intend to. Your financial fortunes depend on the decisions you make in the midst of a crisis. All eyes are on you and how you respond. But we can make all this go away. All it takes is a payment. And we give you the release codes. Your systems are restored, and it's as if this never happened. Don't forget how bad the environmental implications could be. And don't forget the legal fallout from an incident of this magnitude. So, is what we're seeking as a ransom really that bad? Compared with everything you stand to lose if you don't cooperate. So, what are you going to do? Pay us or face the consequences? It's time to decide. Pay or...
So in this scenario, we were introduced to REvil. Now they're a real-life threat actor group, even though this scenario that you've just seen is fictitious. Now the threat being deployed was ransomware. I'm sure you'll all have heard of ransomware, where an organization's files are encrypted and a ransom is demanded, generally in cryptocurrency, for the release key. It's most likely that ransomware will find its way into your systems through a phishing attack, where someone clicks on a bogus link and a network ends up being compromised. Now, some of the more modern attacks simply steal the data and attempt to extort a ransom, but it's likely that encryption will remain central to attacks involving industrial control systems, because attackers will want to lock genuine users out of their industrial systems. So once hackers get in, their movements are offensive rather than covert, as they were in the previous scenario. And once the systems are encrypted, hackers then generally attempt to commence negotiations with the victims of the attack on the dark web, which typically take the form of attempting to agree what, if any, ransom will be paid for the decryption codes. Now, historically, ransomware attacks targeted conventional IT systems. However, in recent years, more ambitious versions of ransomware have been targeting industrial control systems. Now, an early example of that was the Stuxnet worm. Stuxnet was designed and mobilized to attack Iranian nuclear facilities, and it was the world's first cyber weapon that impacted physical infrastructure by targeting centrifuges in an Iranian nuclear facility via a weaponized USB stick. Now, this damaged and destroyed critical military capabilities and caused major disruption to Iran's nuclear program. Now, Steve's going to talk a little later about another type of ransomware called Hatman that targeted industrial control systems. And while specific attacks on industrial control systems remain relatively rare, they do represent a way to target organisations and massively increase the pressure on the victims of the attack. Now, they're likely to be favoured by state-sponsored threat actors for that reason. Now, some of the more sophisticated forms of ransomware developed what became known as the double and then the triple extort model, where the threat level escalated over time to try and force a payment. And sometimes these attacks were accompanied by a denial of service type attack to put further pressure on the party from whom payment was sought. It's not unknown for compromised cyber insurance policy documents to be used by the threat actor to flag that they know what the policy coverage is, and they perceive that to strengthen their negotiating position because they know what insurers may be likely to pay. But businesses are generally becoming more savvy about these types of attack and are gaining familiarity of the types of considerations that accompany the payment of a ransom. And these include legal and regulatory considerations. The question of whether a ransom should be paid is actually quite a complex one from a legal perspective. Some jurisdictions have strict laws and regulations regarding ransom payments, which may render them illegal. And businesses know that they should assess the attacker's credibility. Are the hackers able to keep their promises? Paying a ransom doesn't guarantee that all of your files will be decrypted or that attackers won't demand more money from you in the future. So researching the attacker's history, reputation and track record of providing decryption keys or honouring payment agreements is often an important part of deciding whether a ransom should be paid. Now, a business should also consider the potential impact on its reputation if it becomes known for paying ransoms. Now, that could make a business more attractive as a target for future attacks, as threat actors may view you as being more likely to comply with their demands. So organisations generally need to think about whether paying a ransom really is short-term pain for long-term gain, because in reality, the opposite could be true. Now, businesses also have to evaluate the financial cost of paying a ransom versus the potential costs of rebuilding systems. And that generally involves considering the extent of the attack, the value of encrypted data, the cost of downtime, the availability of backups, and the resources that would require to be invested in the remediation effort. And those costs are then compared to ransoms so a view can be taken on the most cost-effective approach. Now, all of these considerations speak to what I would call conventional business threats, like lost operating time, lost profits, and unexpected business threat expenditure. And while they put the business under pressure, they fall short of the seriousness of compromising the physical safety of people and infrastructure. But in this example, by compromising operational control systems, hackers could target the control systems of an oil rig, including the SCADA and distributed control systems. And by gaining access to the SCADA or DCS systems, they could cause serious damage to the technical infrastructure, which could in turn threaten lives. Now, that's a much more potent way of raising pressure on the target. Now, a threat actor could also compromise the safety systems. Oil rigs have critical safety systems in place to protect against hazardous conditions, such as blowouts, fires, and gas leaks. And hackers could attempt to compromise those safety systems, disabling or manipulating them to create unsafe conditions. Now, that could disrupt drilling operations, production processes, or safety systems, and lead to equipment failures, spills, or explosions. Now, threat actors could also target critical equipment and machinery on the oil rig, such as drilling rigs, pumps, valves, or pipelines. And by tampering with or disabling those components, they could disrupt operations, cause equipment failures, or trigger catastrophic incidents, including threat to life. Now, oil rigs rely on robust communication systems for internal and external communications, including satellite links, radio networks, and data connections. And an attack targeting communication channels could disrupt critical communications, hinder emergency response efforts or coordination with onshore teams, or impact data transmission for real-time monitoring and control. Now, any or all of those risks could present a significant threat to the safety of infrastructure and people, and as such would be a very potent way of ramping up the pressure on an organisation, as the question of saving lives is plainly much more important than the question of saving infrastructure. Now, research recently conducted by DNV expressed concerns about the effect that geopolitical tensions might have on cybersecurity, and a staggering 59% of those questioned indicated that their cyber resilience spend was to increase this year, with that number accepting that cyber threat in the industry was a question of when, not if. So there does appear to be an acceptance within the energy industry that this is going to be an occupational hazard going forward. But the good news is we'll come to see there is a lot that can be done proactively to mitigate threats, and I'll come to look at some of those points before we conclude today. So if we could turn please to our next video, which will focus on insider threat within the manufacturing sector.
My name is Henry. I'm an account manager for a leading drinks manufacturer. This is my best friend, Tanya. We've worked together for 11 years. We work together on everything. I don't know what I'd do without her. This used to be a great place to work. Everyone loved it. We had a great team and the office parties were wild. But things have changed recently. We have a new CEO. Everyone hates him. He's all about the bottom line, and he's been cutting costs to boost profits. He's built a renewable energy plant in our grounds. There have been redundancies to pay for it. Tanya's job is at risk. It's a worrying and demoralizing time. It's not just him. All of the management team are worried and stressed. Tempers flare regularly, and the place isn't what it used to be. A series of pay cuts have just been announced for the staff who survived redundancy. Things have been tight financially for a long time now. I spoke to my boss and asked if I could work extra hours to avoid the pay cut. He didn't take it well. Neither did my wife, Susie. She lost her job 6 months ago and is always stressed about our finances. It's badly affecting her health. I'd had enough. I wanted revenge. I gave this place everything. For 11 years. It came first. Everything else came second. I did software engineering at uni. I started researching whether I could infect the systems with a virus. But writing malware is tricky. Snatching passwords is easier. Much easier. A keylogger is all it takes to grab credentials, and it's hard to trace. And once you have the password, you have complete control of that person's access privileges, and you can do whatever you want. Our manufacturing plant is all digitally controlled and precisely measured. Just a few small changes could be very dangerous, particularly if you disable the safety systems, as I have. As I've not used my credentials, they'll never know it's me. The warehouse guys will set the machines based on the information online and head home. Once the machines are set, I'll sit and wait. The fuse is lit. The temperature will build across the plant, and then, bang. An inferno. But I'm not done yet. Remember those new wind turbines in the new green energy plant? I've changed the revolution rate so they'll catch fire or spin off and break. But that's not just bad news for us. It's bad news for our neighbors too. Overspinning the turbines will disrupt air traffic control at our local airport. Our CEO sits on the board of the airport, so both of his empires will collapse thanks to my actions. He can explain why he installed the turbines so close to an airport and how they've caused so many flights to be cancelled. He'll be finished, just like so many of my friends and colleagues were under his reign. And I'll slip back into the shadows, go home to Susie, and wait to see if I ever receive a knock at the door.
So one of the threats that's very often overlooked from a cyber perspective is insider threat. And much like lone wolf terror attacks, these can be the hardest types of attack to guard against, as employees need to be trusted to carry out their jobs, as it's critical to the success of every organisation. Now, with insider threat, legitimate access to systems is often what is used to perpetrate the attack. So unlike other scenarios, the threat actors wouldn't need to break into systems. Now, we'll all have seen examples of member of finance teams taking advantage of their banking privileges for embezzlement or personal gain. And in this scenario, we met Henry, a disenchanted employee who took it upon himself to settle scores on behalf of his best friend and former colleagues. Now, I think we can all agree that Henry's efforts fall at the extreme end of what a disgruntled member of staff might be capable of. But one of the main things that organisations have fallen foul of, so far as insider threat goes, is unfettered access to systems. If every employee has access to everything on the system, there's significant scope for everything on that system to be compromised. Now, in this scenario, Henry was an account manager, so he would have had absolutely no need in his role to be accessing technical information relating to the manufacturing process. And it's generally best practice to grant access on a need-to-know basis, as that ensures that only a limited amount of information can be compromised in the event that a threat manifests itself. Now, as we saw, Henry used a key logger to snatch credentials. That indicates that his organisation did use a roles-based access controls policy, as he had to try and compromise login credentials to get access to the relevant part of the system. But that forces a more planned and sophisticated attack, which will thin out a significant amount of insider threats, which are typically highly opportunistic. Now, multi-factor authentication could have been a useful additional layer of security in this scenario, as even if Henry had snatched the password, he'd have been unable to log onto the system without the code sent to the genuine employee's mobile device, which would have meant that too had to be compromised for the attack to be successful. And the more layers of security that are added, the harder it is for systems to be compromised. Now, in a conventional office scenario, the main threats that flow from insider threat are misappropriated funds or misappropriated data. But things become much more serious where industrial processes start being interfered with. So unauthorized access to a manufacturing plant's operational systems is likely to compromise control systems, data networks, or production databases. And once compromised, the threat actor could manipulate critical manufacturing settings, sabotage equipment, or launch attacks that compromise the integrity of plant and machinery. And that could lead to the physical damage of infrastructure or compromise the safety of employees, which Malcolm will come on to talk about shortly. Now, where a threat actor targets and takes control of the control systems that are used in manufacturing plants, they've got the potential to disrupt production processes, and that disruption could lead to production delays, product defects, and liabilities for missed orders. Now, most manufacturing plants have quality control systems that are critical to ensuring safe and reliable products are made, and a threat actor could attempt to manipulate or disable these systems, leading to compromised product quality, safety risks, or regulatory compliance issues. And that could be particularly serious, as it could present a public health crisis. Now, that type of tampering can result in faulty products reaching the market, leading to recalls, litigation, and damage to brand reputation. Now, before we wrap up today, I'll look at some of the measures that organisations can take to improve their cyber resilience. But for insider threat, these go beyond technical solutions and strike at the very heart of culture in the workplace. Now, the best way of avoiding bad levers or insider threat is to cultivate a work environment that promotes honesty, transparency, and mutual trust. And that said, any workplace is only as strong as its weakest employee. So prior to hiring new employees, it's helpful to run background checks and verify employment history and references, and that helps identify potential risks associated with individuals who may have malicious intent. And the access controls we discussed earlier, along with multi-factor authentication, is another useful way of making it harder for insider threat to manifest itself. Now, one of the most useful ways of spotting insider threat is to employ monitoring tools and technologies to track and analyze user activities across the organization's network and systems. That helps businesses search for abnormal behaviors, unauthorized access attempts, and data exfiltration. And one of the businesses we work with has a database of over 20% of the world's connected devices, and typical user behavior is tracked over user trends globally rather than simply within the organization, which gives much more reliable data. So if systems are being accessed by unusual people at unusual times of the day or night, a warning will be raised for that alert to be manually checked. So now we've worked our way through each of our scenarios, I'll pass to Steve to talk about some real life examples of how these types of cyber threats can manifest themselves in the workplace.
Thanks, Craig. Well, as Craig's mentioned, the Vulcan files that came out have confirmed, to be honest, what we've known for a long time, that nation states train the next generation of threat actors to potentially attack national infrastructure. But it's not just the Russians. We all do it. So every single country in the world predominantly has a cyber division. Will look for weaknesses within other states' national infrastructure. These type of cyber attacks have been dating back to the 1990s, but if you look in the press recently with regard to nation state activity. You can date them back to 2011, but what are they actually for? Because they don't do anything. What they're actually looking for is the weaknesses within national infrastructure networks. They want to find the easiest way in. Every time that your IT department, your security department is upgrading their systems, there will be a different type of weakness. 0 days are found on a daily, weekly basis that haven't been thought of before, which is basically what they are. So when you look at a state-sponsored attack, you firstly must understand that it's very politically motivated, and it must be ordered by either the head of the state or somebody very high up within the political infrastructure. I suppose the most recent major attack of this type would have been when Russia decided to invade the Ukraine 18 months ago. The day before, they took down the Starlink computer or communication system, basically effectively taking out the Ukraine's ability to talk to their forces. Within that attack, which is something I'll come on to later, they actually took down 5,000 German wind turbines at the same time, which they weren't expecting, but more on that in a little while. When you're looking at these type of attacks, secondly, it needs to be a success. If it's not a success, the nation state will be vilified within the press for not having good cyber structure within their organizations. It would be embarrassing to the political heads, and potentially it could be disastrous for them internally. The thing is, because they've been gathering this information for many, many years, they probably already know a way into your systems. Something will be easy for them. If they don't know a way in and they really want to do some damage to your systems and they're pushed into a corner, which we all know that could happen, they have a vast amount of computing power. And what they could do is do a disruptive denial of service attack by pointing all of their computer resources at one single organization, and effectively using all of your computer power, effectively shutting your systems down. Now, last month, NCSC, as Craig mentioned, warned that there's an emerging threat, specifically to countries that have helped the Ukraine or have been sympathetic to Ukraine due to the invasion. Whilst this is something that they have to report, there have been attacks, which could be practice attacks, on several Eastern European countries on their transportation networks. So they are looking to do these type of activities. Next slide, please. What you really must understand, and that these type of attacks could happen, and they probably will. With these rising tensions that we mentioned, especially with the latest developments with F-16 fighters being authorized by the Americans for delivery to the Ukraine, it could push them into a corner where they feel that there's no other option to wear down the support for the Ukraine but by starting a massive cyber attack that would take down infrastructure within the countries that support the Ukraine. That could be the transportation network. It could be the electricity network or other utilities. We may have seen a few years ago when the mobile phone networks went down, I think 3-4 years ago. Certainly a lot of the younger individuals now really struggled to function normally because they didn't have access to the mobile phone. If you can't charge it, where are we going to go? What are we going to do, etc. So these type of things have massive effects. It's very important to practice these type of simulations. You don't know what your staff do unless they're under pressure. These type of incidents will be incredibly stressful for the individuals involved. You should always run blue team training, war games for your security teams, because they are very, very good, but we're very practiced at being stealthy. If you can't see us, you can't stop us. So they need to know how to how to find people like us within a network. Also looking from more an IT side of things is how easy is it to traverse your network. I mentioned, or Malcolm mentioned, when I first joined the IT industry, we were all told to have very, very flat networks, you know, HP, Dell, IBM, flat networks, get your information really, really quickly. A flat network is a hacker's dream, because if there is no segregation or air gapping within the system, as soon as we get in, we can go straight for your crown jewels and take over. If you have an external security operations center monitoring your networks, do you test their responses? Because you should. I've seen it firsthand where companies spend a huge amount of money on products that actually are meant to be monitoring every device on their network. And we've sat inside doing our testing, you know, our activities, and 15 days after we've been in the network, the IT department gets an email asking if they're upgrading their systems. That's not what you need. These systems use a lot of AI. AI is only as good as what it's seen. If it hasn't seen something, it's never going to report it. Patch policy, you may have all heard of, but patch policy is so important because every patch is normally a result of a vulnerability that a hacker has discovered. Also, Microsoft updates its software on what we call Patch Tuesday, the first Tuesday of every month. And whilst your teams are installing the patches, even if they're automatic, hackers will have found the new vulnerabilities before the patch is even on your systems. Also, it's very, very important to review your company, your corporate websites. Don't provide information that hackers can use. Your supplier list, for example. Supply chain attacks are common, but like Craig mentioned, if we know the right uniform to wear, the right passes to have, the right paperwork to have, and who we're meant to work for, we can walk into your buildings. All it takes is a bit of bravado, like Craig said, high-vis jacket, hard hat, and a pair of boots, and most of the time you get let in. Next slide, please. So with that being said, for transport, if we look at the energy sector, we all probably remember the Colonial Pipeline attack, which happened a couple of years ago when petroleum supply was actually shut down within the US for 7 days on the East Coast. Whilst this was a standard attack, obviously an absolute nightmare for the company and for the people within the United States, or that part of the United States, it is something that is going to happen more and more. Major companies, Colonial Pipeline had 65,000 staff. One person needs to click on the link, and that computer, as Craig said, was taken over within 3 seconds. The whole of their network was taken down within 6 hours, and that's with your IT team working. There is nothing they can do. Ransomware will move by itself. Unfortunately now, though, the National Crime Agency has seen a marked rise in the targeting of senior executives and management as a way of launching these type of attacks. Unfortunately, criminal gangs are targeting family and friends, sending the executive photographs of children entering school, for example, and use them to convince those individuals to actually click the malware and run it so that nothing happens to the children. It's a huge and terribly emotional thing for these people involved, and they don't know what to do. 9 times out of 10, will they tell the police, get them involved, etc.? The thing, if you take anything away from this presentation, is be very, very careful what you put on social media. If you're in a position where you think you may be attacked or attacked in this type of way, be very careful what you put on there. Smokescreen ransomware is something that is becoming more prominent, very difficult to identify because the smokescreen is actually the ransomware. So your IT team will be enacting all its disaster protocols, trying to stop the infection spreading, when what the individuals involved are really looking for is access to industrial control systems. As Craig mentioned, Stuxnet in the past, Hatman 2 is basically a clone of that particular malware, which was used by the Americans to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. Unfortunately, with these type of aggressive malwares, it was seen by the criminals, it's used. It now has ransomware running as a screen, and the actual malware itself is looking for your industrial controls and to leave a back door for the attackers to get back in at a later stage. Very difficult to find, and unfortunately it is in the wild now. Next slide, please. So these type of things will happen and do happen on a daily basis. You know, we've seen recently with the MoveIt ransomware that is currently running. The thing to remember is the human firewall is your biggest security asset, but it's also your biggest weakness. Phishing simulations, as Craig mentioned, are incredibly important, just to focus your staff's attention on what could happen, how this could happen, what to look for, etc., etc. But they only go so far because they are unfortunately limited. The real type of cyber attack that will be used, and this, you know, is a scenario that will probably be used this year because of the increased profits that everybody has seen that the energy sector has made, would get an email such as this, you know, thank you for your ongoing commitment to the company. Please see a breakdown of your one-off staff bonus. This is being paid because of the increased profits we've seen this experience this financial year. You know, from a staff member to it from a, you know, you can get this information from LinkedIn, or if you're attacker or a hacker or ransomware gang, you will buy it on the dark web for potentially between 8 and 10p a record, which is a person's name, address, email address. For the correct person for this to be sent to, or sent from, sorry, you can find those company's house because it would come from a senior director. This type of attack will potentially come at the end of a financial year, or more likely around Christmas time. They always do. As I said earlier, Colonial Pipeline, one person in their 65,000 strong workforce clicked on a link, and we all saw what happened. Next slide, please. So looking at insider threats, whilst you think insider threat comes in one category, we actually break it down into 6, and some of these we've actually gone over before, but we'll run through them quickly. So departing employees that leave voluntarily or involuntarily, are the most common type of insider threat. They could take material, they're proud to get a new job, or more viciously, they could steal or expose sensitive data or systems to the outside world. Malicious insider, we've mentioned, or Craig mentioned, these type of employees, not your biggest fan. They have grievances with the company, so they've been passed over for promotion, they haven't got a pay rise, so they decide, instead of just disclosing secret information, they could sabotage systems, they could change the way turbines spin within the products that are made by the company. As Craig mentioned, when wind turbines first came out, one was actually positioned about 2 miles away from East Midlands Airport, and because of the speed it was spinning, affected the air traffic control system at the airport and had to be shut down. This wasn't known, but it was spotted by a lot of people, and if I know about it, everybody else that does what I do knows about it too. Negligent workers. Although insider threat strategies often focus on malicious insider, careless workers are much more dangerous. These employees can unintentionally put an organization at risk by leaving unencrypted work devices unattended, not signing into the VPN, or bringing their own device to work without it actually being logged onto the network and using their passwords. Incredibly dear, you can only plan for what you know. Your policies will not cover a lot of these things. Another very, very common insider threat is the security evader. Modern companies have security policies to safeguard your essential systems and data, but some workers find these very inconvenient, makes their work harder, so they find a workaround. Unfortunately, these these increase the chances of a breach. BA staff many years ago, just after, unfortunately for them, the ICO came into existence, a BA staff member downloaded all of their staff details from human resources on a USB hard drive, went to the library in West London in Uxbridge, and unfortunately left his USB device on a table. This was then looked at by somebody who picked it up and sent to the newspapers. Bet you can't guess which newspaper it went to though. Insider agents, we've mentioned those, where people are either extorted, blackmailed, or bribed into downloading the credentials. And then the last that we've mentioned, a supply chain attack. Third-party partners aren't on your payroll, but if they have direct access to your systems because it's a need, then these are very, very dangerous, because your security is only as good as their security. Marriott Hotels bought a company, integrated them into the computer system. Unfortunately, the app that the new company used wasn't secure, and that gave the attackers access to the whole of Marriott's database for credit card details. Again, could have done a lot more, but they were focused on money. Next slide, please. So I suppose in summary, it's very important to remember that all cyber breaches affect your employees' health and well-being and are very, very stressful for the individuals involved. Stress levels during and after these events are high, and typically the blame game is going to start. I have seen this firsthand when we carried a authorized red team attack on a major global engineering firm. The IT director asked us to, with no credentials whatsoever, breach their systems, get elevator privileges all the way through to become the finance director, and send him an email saying we'd completed the exercise. We were given 250 days to do this, and we took 18 days. The security team completely felt like the scapegoat and were not happy. And everybody on the call, when we were delivering the results, were blaming each other. What we then decided, in conjunction with the company involved, we spent the rest of the time that had been allocated to run war games and help train the security team on what to look for and how to engage when they spot an attack on their systems. This type of training is very, very important to give your staff the tools that they need to actually help and foil these type of attacks. It's very difficult to find good security people. Don't lose them because you're not training them and treating them the way they should be kept. The most important thing as well to remember with all of these type of attacks, a cyber attacker can do whatever he wants to do. He can steal, he can store, he can cause danger to life. A computer will do as it's told. It has no conscience, and it never says no. Thank you.
So why have we sort of badged this seminar as cyber and health and safety? What are the legal implications that I see from cyber risk? And why are we talking about these two things together? Well, the reason we've put them together is that there's a risk, I think, for all businesses to look at cyber attacks. Although they're very well understood, we know the issue, we're probably familiar with a number of the things that Craig and Steve have said this morning, but there is a tendency to look at cyber as an IT, a data focused, or a technical issue. And I don't think there is enough of a discussion around cyber risk in the context of physical risk to the business rather than operational threats or financial challenges. Organizations, I'm sure all of you on the seminar today will have a cybersecurity risk assessment and a health and safety risk assessment, or a number of health and safety risk assessments. But how often do they actually interact? How often do you feed the risks that you identify from a cyber perspective into your risk matrix from a health and safety perspective. And my view is that the reality is that cyber attacks must be seen as the same health and safety risk as, you know, a hydrocarbon release on a platform offshore, a trip hazard in the office, a fire risk in your hotel. They are exactly the same risk from a legal perspective. And the reason for that is because the cyber risk can create that physical risk. The cyber risk is as much of a threat to your business as a guest in your hotel leaving a cigarette burning in the wrong part of the hotel overnight, or somebody not completing the isolation of a gas valve properly. The causal factor is different, but the end result is exactly the same. And the other factor, as Craig and Steve have mentioned, is that quite often the primary motivation for the attack will be political, financial damage, reputational damage. It may be that physical harm is a secondary motive, or it may be, in the example of the German wind turbines that Steve gave, it's a completely unintended consequence of a cyber attack, not just on your organization, but a cyber attack elsewhere in the world. So we have a situation where the more sophisticated cyber attacks become, and clearly, as we've heard from Craig and Steve, they are now incredibly sophisticated. They have an ever-increasing risk or ability, depending on the motive of the hacker, to cause physical consequences, operational consequences in your business that fall squarely into what we might see as traditional health and safety. We can move on to the next slide, please. And as we heard, and as we all know, in the modern world, there really is very little, not just in our working lives, but in our lives generally, very little is not connected to, controlled by, updated by an IT system of some kind. Everything is connected to the cloud. And that means that a cyber attack can cause any number of things. We've heard a number of examples already this morning, and I've put a few thoughts that I had up there on the slide. They can overspin a piece of machinery and cause fire or explosion. They can turn off valves in your water system and or to open valves in your water system and cause floods. They can compromise your security systems at work. They can let all the doors open. They can lock all the doors. They can cause machinery malfunctions. They can shut down your backup generators. There's anything you think about within your working environment, an IT attack, a cyber attack can influence that, and therefore can create a physical risk to your employees and to members of the public. But it's not just physical or environmental risk, and Steve touched on it at the end of his session there. This can be and will be hugely stressful for your employees, particularly if you are that one person at Colonial Pipelines who inadvertently clicked on the link that allowed the hackers to access the network. You're that one person at Christmas time who thinks that's a genuine email about a bonus. An employee who inadvertently is a source of a breach of your network, they are going to be incredibly stressed by that. And even though they've done something that has obviously significantly impacted your organization, the law still expects you to look after their mental well-being. So there's a whole gamut of health and safety issues here. There's the physical risk, environmental risk, public risk, but also mental health and well-being for employees who are directly involved. But it wouldn't be a legal seminar, and we've managed to keep it going for, I think, an hour and 6 minutes before anyone has actually looked at some law, but I thought better put a slide up with some law on it. And the question, of course, everyone will ask is, well, does UK health and safety law apply to cyber threats? And the short answer is yes, it absolutely does. It's not just limited to traditional physical risks. And I've given just 4 examples there on the slide of provisions from, obviously, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, and the COMA regulations, which particularly those of you in high-risk industries like energy or chemical manufacture will be very familiar with. And all of them are perfectly capable of being interpreted and would, I think, readily be interpreted by a court as applying to cyber threats. So the first point there, it's our obligation, all of us as employers, to make sure the place of work is maintained in a way that is safe and without risk to health. That would include, I think, maintaining or preventing the ability of somebody to lock all the external doors and set the fire alarms off because of a cyber attack. Equally, we all have duties to protect members of the public in terms of Section 3 of the 1974 Act. So to use the example Craig gave of overspinning a wind turbine, if that wind turbine is in an area where perhaps it's built up, it's urban rather than a very rural setting, there is a duty to ensure that that can't be overspun and put on fire and creating a risk to members of the public who live or work nearby. The health and safety work regulations for risk assessment clearly apply to any and all risks that our employees are exposed to while they're at work, and that includes risks created by cyber attacks. And then finally, and perhaps most relevantly to particularly to the oil and gas example that Craig and Steve have talked about, under the COMA regulations, every operator must take all measures necessary to prevent major accidents and limit their consequences. Every operator must take all measures. There isn't much qualification, there isn't any qualification in that. That will undoubtedly include measures taken to prevent major accidents caused by a cyber attack. So it may have seemed odd to you when we advertised this session that we were bringing cyber security and health and safety together. I hope as we've gone through the last hour or so, it's become obvious why we think the two sit together, why we think cyber risk and health and safety risk assessments have to be done in tandem. I suspect we've scared a few of you, particularly anyone who suddenly finds people in reception with high-vis jackets and ladders this morning. There's going to be an extra degree of suspicion. But we're going to end, hopefully, on a slightly more positive note with Craig giving us, in addition to the tips Steve's already given, some top tips for resilience from cyber attacks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Malcolm. So you'll see that I've split these tips into operational resilience, which are things that the business can do at an operational level, and the operational technology resilience, which are things that a business can do at a technical level. So to start with operational resilience, incident response plans. Do you have one? Has it been tested? Where is it stored? And is it up to date? Quite often we encounter a situation where there's a beautiful incident response plan that's saved in a system that's been crippled by ransomware. So it's worth printing it out and having it somewhere that is accessible even if your IT infrastructure fails. And make sure that the plan contains accurate contact details for members of the incident response team, because the midst of a crisis is not the time to realise that your plan's out of date, particularly given a lot of threats emerge at bank holiday weekends, Thanksgiving, various things like that. Business continuity and disaster recovery plans. It's sensible to have an all hazards policy or an IT disaster recovery plan. It's not just cyber threat that can impact the business, and whilst an incident response plan might direct the response to a crisis, it's helpful to have a coordinated way in which you can resume business as usual operations in the aftermath of a crisis. And to that end, tabletop exercises are a useful way of simulating threats. There's an old saying, sweat more on the training ground, bleed less on the battlefield. So no business should find itself working through an incident response plan for the first time in the midst of a crisis. It should be tested using realistic threat scenarios to ensure familiarity with the expected response and spot any gaps that might exist ahead of time. Device mapping and threat intelligence. I never cease to be amazed by how many large organizations have no idea how many electronic devices they have. And plainly, you can only protect what you know you have. So if you don't know the full extent of your IT infrastructure, you really do have a significant blind spot. And device mapping can help find every device that connects to a network, and it can also show wormholes into networks like connected medical devices, printers, or CCTV. And cyber threat intelligence is also very useful. Quite often you can find out that you've had credentials compromised, they'll be posted for sale on the dark web, so it's quite useful to have a reasonably regular sweep to see whether or not there's any signs that all is not well on hacker sites. And there's certainly been some merger and acquisition activity in recent years that could have benefited from some CTI, because it's not a terribly uncommon situation for a merger to go through to realise that the entity that's been purchased has had some vulnerability that's then manifested itself in a fine for the purchaser. And training, we've spoken at length about phishing emails and the like. It's important that people understand that they don't click on things that will bring vulnerabilities to the organizations. And as Steve touched on, social media policies are actually very helpful to regulate what can and can't be posted, because the more that is known about you, the easier it is to imitate you by threat actors. Turning to operational technology resilience, as we've covered, updates are obviously very important. There's no point in having updates available and not doing it. It's the equivalent to leaving a new lock for the door in a bag in the garage. So make sure that it's updated if it can be. Risk assessments. Don't find out in the midst of a crisis what's going to happen when your critical infrastructure fails. Have a think about what that's going to be ahead of time, and make sure that you have the appropriate contingencies in place. Access controls, as Steve said, if there's no access controls within a network, once you're in, you have unfettered access to everything. It's like getting through the front door of a house that's got no other lock than any other door. You've got complete access. But if every door in the house is locked, it's harder to find your way through. Penetration testing, as Malcolm said at the start, and that's what Pentest Limited is all about. Don't leave it to the bad guys to find your vulnerabilities. Test your systems to find your own vulnerabilities and find them before they do. That way security issues can be addressed, if they can be addressed. I said at the outset, some of OT technology is old and not capable of being supported, but if security vulnerabilities that are found can't be addressed, then at least strategic business decisions can be made about allocating budget for upgrades, etc. And as with the operational resilience piece, training, very important. Make sure your staff are able to spot operational instabilities in OT systems. Quite often there can be signs that all is not well, the system's slowing down, etc. Staff should know how to avoid introducing threat into the OT environment, and they should make sure that they are able to undertake manual checks so it avoids an over-reliance on what the devices are telling them.
Thanks very much, Craig. There's a little slide there to show you Nortal's global presence and experience. So if anyone has needs in any of those countries, then Craig is very happy to help. I'm very conscious that we are now at time. We said we would finish at 10:30. Very happy for Craig, Steve and I to stay on for a couple of minutes and answer any questions if anyone has any. Equally, those of you who have other meetings, I appreciate you'll have to jump on to those. So I'll give it just a few seconds in case any hands go up or any questions go into the chat box. Very briefly, Craig, there's one which we can perhaps take 2 minutes to cover, and it's one I'm interested in because it's about electric cars, which I am one of the owners of. They're obviously getting smarter and smarter. They're connected to the internet. Are they at risk, a safety risk from cyber attacks, do you think?
I think the short answer is yes. Anything that relies heavily on technology is capable of being compromised. So, electric vehicles are no different to that. Last year, there was an episode where electric vehicle charging points were compromised. So rather than the usual message when you draw up, it was an adult website that appeared on the screen instead. So there's already signs of these types of attacks taking place. Even at manufacturing level, in 2020 there was a ransomware threat called ECANS, which specifically targeted industrial control systems, which disrupted production for Honda in Japan. And earlier this year, a tannoy was compromised in an Austrian train, and you can readily see how, if false information is being given on a crowded train about an evacuation or something, how that could manifest itself in a health and safety threat. But yes, you're absolutely right. Anything that's got a degree of connectivity can be compromised. We've already seen it with charging stations, and indeed, a very large global company has just had a significant data breach in terms of information that's gathered by electric vehicles. I think something close to 1 terabyte was compromised. News of that broke last week. So it's not just the cars themselves, it's the information that sits within and beyond them about home charging points, and there's personal data that relates to that. So all of that, represents a threat, because the more data that you gather, the greater the obligation, of course, to make sure that that is kept safe and not compromised. And that's presented an issue within the last week.
Yep, great.
I will
Thanks,
say it's not just electric cars. Most cars can be compromised because they all have Bluetooth on them. So it is a known threat that all manufacturers are trying to protect a lot of the devices that send information back for when your service is needed, etc., etc. They're not the best systems, put it that way. So whilst most of us can't avoid using Bluetooth in our cars, just be aware that somebody potentially could put the brakes on.
Well, on that slightly terrifying note, we have run over time, so we'll draw things to a close now. Obviously, very grateful to Steve and Craig for giving up their time. Very grateful to all of you for joining us this morning. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.